So continuing to take advantage of the weirdly warm September weather, I'm doing another overnighter, and this time I'm heading down to Glenmalure across the Featherbed, and I've got this route starting at the entrance to the Phoenix Park, but you can join it at several points depending on where in the city you are. One of the easy ones would be, for instance, to come up the Grand Canal and join where I cross that. This is a tough backpacking route in terms of height climbed, not so much distance, it's 65 kilometers, but running north to south you're going to be climbing about 1600 meters, and some of that with very serious slopes up to 15% and quite a few above 10%. So we just stopped at the Grand Canal at Drimnagh, waiting for the lights to change. This is the other obvious point to join this route because there's a cycle track up and down the canal to this point, so it's an easy place to plug yourself in. This next bit of the route I would definitely recommend having an earpiece in and using an app that gives turn-by-turn directions like cycle.travel. See the review I've done of that. That's basically because, as you can see, there's lots of little backs and forths as you're switching between side roads, and if you miss one of those it's quite irritating because you're going to have to backtrack quite a bit to get yourself back on track. But this route is good because you hit very little actual traffic on it. It's nearly all these quiet back roads, and if you cycle in Dublin and you're familiar with this bit of the city, it's quite a revelation because the main arterial roads here are all quite unpleasant with the volume of traffic they get. We're passing through the inner suburbs of Dublin at the moment and going to end up in a while going through the outer ones, but let's talk about the route beyond that. So what we're going to be doing is following the military road that was built in the aftermath of the 1798 rebellion in Ireland, and that's an absolutely huge rebellion involving tens of thousands of people against British rule and, importantly, for a republic. It was put down very brutally, but continued on for a number of years afterwards in some localities, including down in Glenmalure in Wicklow. So the road was built in order to quickly transport British troops down the spine of the Wicklow Mountains and suppress what remained of the rebellion there. I told you all this while cycling, but I messed up and forgot to put the camera on video, so that was me giving more or less the same spiel at that particular point. It's a great bikepacking route because there are some serious challenges in terms of the hills, both in terms of the total elevation but also the steepness of them, and I've talked about that a bit earlier. And here we are arriving at the first of these, and this is also the point that we're starting to leave the city. We'll be coming up to the M50 overpass in a moment, and that really marks the boundary of this part of the city where you're going into the foothills. So 13 kilometers in, we're crossing the M50, and pretty much from this point it gets much more rural. Housing estates up to here with initially the old 1930s to 1950s public housing, and then increasingly green and leafy as you head towards the hills. But yeah, so now we've got this roundabout here, which I'm going to be going left on, and then it starts to get much more rural for the rest of this trip. Although these are narrow roads, car drivers are well used to cyclists being on them because it's such a popular day route in and out of the city among sports cyclists. So it is, to be honest, safe enough, even if you sometimes feel it's a bit close. So as you probably noticed, once you get out of the suburbs, it starts going uphill very quickly, and there's a lot more of that to come. We've ascended 170 meters since our starting point. Parts of the road are at about 600 meters, so there's quite a lot of ascent to come. So I'm grabbing a quick break, taking my hat off, and pushing on. The steepest section of the journey is in fact pretty much going from this point up to the Featherbeds, up to the viewing point just before the Featherbeds. I think there's a 13% climb for part of this, although it has to be said, and I didn't expect it, it also gets very steep again coming out of Lara, where you're climbing up to then go over the pass and down into Glenmalure. So don't be too discouraged by the fact this hits you pretty early on. This is a struggle to get up, but once you get up here, you then have a fairly flat bit across the top of the Featherbeds, a descent into Glencree, and we'll see all these in a minute, and then a more minor climb back up to the Sally Gap. There's very little parts of this where the road is boring or dull though, like basically there's something going on just about all the time. So we've just passed the entrance of the Hellfire Club there, and a little bit further back Massey's Estate. So if you're coming out of Dublin and looking for somewhere to wild camp, you could probably get away with either of those two places. But it's more stealth camping than anything else. You want to stay out of sight, but so that's 16 kilometers out of the city and 260 meters of climbing. So the climb's going to hurt. In my video on keeping the batteries charged while you're e-bike touring, I talk about how it's a good idea before you set out to go up some very steep hill and just watch how the estimated range will fall to practically a tiny fraction of what it was. So right now mine has fallen from 130 at the base of this hill to 55. I'm not worried. I'm going to get up to the top of it, and then there's going to be downhill stretches, and my experience is actually you don't get an identical ranges on the flat, but it's actually not that massive a reduction. Wind and stuff are more important, but anyway, that's one to watch out for when you do this hill. And another very steep section of the climb here, which is the last section up to the viewing point. Some nice woodlands on either side, and although you can't see it here, you're beginning to get a great view out over the left hand side here and over the city. We'll look at it here in fact. And so that gets us up to viewing point, 372 meters, so that's about half of the total elevation gain we're going to need to make today. And I'm not ashamed to say I went up to tour mode on that hill. Oh Jesus. But it is the worst actually of the entire loop I'm going to do, I think. Ah, sweet innocence. I hadn't done the section from Lara to Glenmalure before, so I didn't realise that I was going to be facing as bad an ascent again at that particular stretch. So in fact, far from having done about half the ascent at this point, I'd only done about a fifth of it. This is about half the ascent as far as Sally Gap, in fact. Probably a little bit less because you do go down and then back up again. But if you're only going that far, that's probably giving you a reasonably good picture of it. So what we're seeing now is the mountain bog that stretches on both sides of the road for all the high parts of this route down as far as Lara. Could you camp on this? Yes, there's certainly spots you could pull in. It's pretty wet and boggy. However, you would be very, very exposed, and a lot of the time the wind and the rain up here can be pretty intense. So I don't think I'd recommend it. I think I'd be looking for woodlands basically and lower points on the route if you were going to be camping. That said, on a day like the day I'm doing it today, you probably could have and you'd have been grand. But no, I generally look for the woods. At this point we've descended into Glencree, the head of the valley, and now we're ascending up the other side of it. So just stopping here briefly at the entrance to Lough Bray. It's a good place to go swimming if you want a break. There's a privately owned house with a beach at the far end of it, so you're obviously not meant to go to that, but this end of the lake there's a path that runs up and it's easy enough to get in and go for a swim there. It's also this side of the lake is the route to go up Eagle's Peak over there, which brings you onto Capura. So good cooling off point. I'll stick in some older photos I have of it. Here's me swimming in Lough Bray the previous year. The only issue is you can't really get your bike down to the lake, so you'll need to lock it to one of the signs. See the video I have on locking bikes?
An advantage to stopping at Lower Lough Bray is it gives you a chance to get your breath before taking the ascent to the viewing point above Upper Lough Bray. There's a larger car parking area here, so you see more people stopped up here above the loch, and a very good view indeed from it.
So we've now reached the viewing point above Lower Lough Bray, Upper Lough Bray down below us, which is quite a nice walk. There's a well-defined trail and you can see loads of people walking down there at the moment. The two upper low ones are both glacial corrie lakes, so about 10,000 years ago this was all a big ice sheet that was moving down the Glencree Valley, carving out that valley, and the base of those glaciers were deep in those lakes, so they're both actually very deep. I remember as a kid when we used to swim in Lower Lough Bray, we were told it was bottomless. Now I don't think that's quite true, but surprisingly deep. This time of the summer the surface water is pretty warm, but I did find in the spring it was interesting on a sunny day, because although the surface water was warm the first 6 inches, it was actually very cold underneath it. Yeah, nice place for a hike, and again that arete between the two lakes is a kind of popular hiking route up to Capure, which is the highest mountain at this end of the Wicklow Mountains. We're nearly at the top of the highest point of the military road. That's a bit further up, just short of the Sally Gap crossroads, but we've now climbed 585 meters, which is quite a climb in 26 kilometers. So yep, that's where we are, back to the road.
So if you're doing this as a one-day cycle down to Glenmalure, you have crossed about 1/3 of the total climb here, and also in fact about 1/3 of the total distance. There is a road coming up here on the right where those trees are, and that is the access road to the top of Capure Mountain. There's a bar up there to stop cars driving up it, but you can go around that bar on a bike and in fact cycle all the way up to the top. It's also quite a popular walk. You also crossed the 520 meters above sea level contour line at this point, and I just double checked the maps and I'm pretty sure that is in fact the highest point of the entire trip, by quite a bit, although because you go down and come back up again, the ascent at Lara can feel like it's about as steep as this one has just been.
So we're pretty much at the high point of the road. Capure is just over here beside me. For those of you interested in battery, so I am now about 28 kilometers in and 630 meters of climb, and in the last couple of kilometers I've just dropped from the fully charged 5-pip battery down to the 4 pips. Now I'm not actually quite sure how Bosch worked the pips. I had the impression that actually the later pips have less charge in them, they're not all 20%, but then I'm also not sure if that's because when you get to the later pips you've often been cycling all day and you're banjaxed, so you're pulling much more power from the battery in comparison with your legs. But in any case, all the way up here on that first pip of battery charge. So although my range meter dropped pretty drastically, as low as 30 kilometers at one point, it's now at 57. That's basically because I've climbed 643 meters, and now in the rest of this trip there's a bit more climb, there's a little bit of up and down coming, but it's mostly going to be down, and I'll see a lot of that range come back to me.
Okay, I was wrong about that only being a little bit more climb, but I was right about the most of the range coming back. In fact, on this day I did about 95 kilometers at 1700 meters uphill, and I think at the end of the day my battery was still giving me about another 10 kilometers of distance, so that's pretty impressive. You know, that an implied total distance of 105 kilometers despite a very, very significant amount of climbing during the day.
So I was just crossing the Sally Gap there, so other road running down to Enniskerry, and then Blessington, the bog around there is actually the Liffey head bog. That's where the Liffey River That's where the river Liffey rises and then flows in a big loop around the mountains before you cross it on the canals and it comes into Dublin. So what you probably notice for this stretch is it's suddenly much quieter. No cars have passed me at all yet, which is pretty typical basically, because this is a very narrow winding road, and if you're trying to get to Glendalough from Dublin, you're probably not going to drive this route. It takes you much longer. You get the occasional car on it. There is one coming up behind me now. And then from this you can see the other issue you have. There's a lot of cyclists on this road. In fact, I'll be passed today by far more cyclists than by cars, so you're also going to be slowing down for cyclists and looking for a safe space to pass them, as this guy is likely doing behind me. Drivers tend to be very used to cyclists. They're just going to be coming onto them constantly, so they're fairly sensible about the passing. I've only had one bad pass so far today, back towards Glencree. So although it kind of, you might think this isn't a particular safe route because of the narrow roads and things, it's actually absolutely grand in my experience. You know, the one issue I have with it is there's very few places you could actually pull in safely if you do have a line of traffic behind you. Because the either side of the road, actually there's one there, but either side of the road tends to fall off quite sharply and often into bog. So that's a bit tricky. But yeah, good safe road, good surface on it too, and it's probably the nicest route out of Dublin by far. I've seen very few other bikepackers on it. I suspect because people look at the elevation gains on a map and go, oh my god, I'm not doing that. And actually that's not unreasonable. Those are real enough. But once you get up here, you've got this very long, slightly downhill stretch that's going to take us to Glenmacnass waterfall, and then a steep downhill stretch from there. It's quite a pleasant cycle.
So if you are using this route as a kind of warm-up bikepacking route, this is of course the tough one. The canal loop I've done previously is the easy one. Then around about now you might be thinking about somewhere that you could actually camp for the night. Now, as I've already said, while you can camp on this open bog, it's possible. I'm not sure I'd recommend it because it's going to be very exposed. Wind picks up, starts raining, particularly at night. You know, it would be a very tough place to find yourself. You're still at about 400 meters here. However, the section we're coming to now is forested, and there are a lot of spots in from that forest where you could possibly pull in. So part of my purpose with this trip was to check out some of the spots and more or less just show that actually that's pretty straightforward.
So once you get across that gate, about 20 meters in, there's a bit of a clearing. It's a bit rubbishy, but there's enough space to put a couple of tents up here, for instance. You're far enough away from the road that traffic wouldn't bother you. Somebody's had a fire here already. Yeah, so there are these spaces in the various forests you'll pass. The challenge tends to be an awful lot of them on very steep slopes. So actually finding somewhere like this that's quite flat is, yeah, that's a winner. This is a couple of kilometres from Glencree waterfall. I've stopped.
So that was the first one I checked out. I mean, in this particular stretch, there's also a number of points you can just leave the forest at the road and try those. But just down here, I spotted another one with some bricks locking it off. And amusingly enough, it turned out there was somebody already camped in there. You probably hardly saw that on the video, but I was basically, don't want to bother people, just going to move on. The general reality of wild camping, wild backpacking in Ireland is you probably don't have permission to do it. There may even be a sign saying you can't do it, But if you're pulling up here as you're getting towards sunset, then there's nobody that's going to even be checking. And, you know, just make sure you clean up afterwards, leave no traces, they say, i.e. if somebody arrives 10 minutes afterwards, they shouldn't even know you're there. And that way we're all going to get on and continue using these spaces.
This is the car park at Glencree waterfall. The waterfall itself is spectacular, but it's also the starting point if you're going to climb Tonlagee, or if you're one of those Instagram people, if you want to get a picture of that heart-shaped lake, Lough Bray, which is actually on the way to Tonlagee, up here, up over the river, up over the ridge. And then you have to hike to quite a height to actually get the heart shape effect, so it's not for the faint-hearted, but it's a nice walk. And actually, if you can get up Tonlagee once you've got that far easily enough, you're going to be on the shoulder of it on Tonlagee North anyway. But yeah, so getting to the end of the long flat central bit of the military road here, and now there's going to be the descent from Glenmacnass to Lough, which is quite thrilling, steep.
As we're going down this descent, there are a couple of other forests that might also be suitable for spending the night. As you get down towards Lough itself, that's very built up with fairly posh houses, so I wouldn't recommend trying to camp down towards the village. You're probably going to get moved on, but there's definitely a couple of spots here, and in particular as you get down towards the bottom, the Wicklow Way crosses the road, and I'm going to swing quickly up one side of the Wicklow Way to have a look. This isn't it here, this is another forest spot. If you're not familiar with Ireland, the Wicklow Way is a long distance hiking route that runs all the way down the Wicklow Mountains. People do it over a few days. There are a couple of huts on it and sort of semi-approved camping spots. I think there are a couple of actually officially approved ones on the way. But the reality is that a lot of people obviously wild camp it because there wouldn't be any other way of doing it. Anyway, we're just about to get to the point across the road, and as you'll see, the wood on the left, so the entrance on the left, is relatively suitable. I cycle up this for a few hundred meters just to have a look, but I also actually stopped then and had a look at the right. Not quite so suitable, but again, you know, if you're bike packing, you're doing it with a tiny tent, so it's probably easy enough to find a space between some trees to actually squeeze that tent in. It's not like you're arriving with one of those giant 4-person tents. You are getting towards the posher bit of Lough, so that's something to keep in mind. Yeah, so this is the Wicklow Way coming down onto the road. And the woods on either side. There's a bit of an opening up here, which I was also thinking that would probably be grand, and then back down and to the other side of the road down to the river, where I think you'd also probably get away with it, setting up at sunset and then moving on in the morning early enough. I mean, a major purpose of the leave no trace philosophy behind wild camping and the bike packing variants of that is that apart from we shouldn't be making a mess of the places we're camping anyway, it's also that really if you are setting up late in the evening and you're gone early in the morning, then who's going to even know you were there? I mean, the answer is sometimes some dog walkers, if you're on a beach, some early morning swimmers, but most people have a pretty high level of tolerance towards somebody who's either obviously hiked some distance or cycled some distance to get in there in the first place, and they're not going to be bothered complaining, and if you're not leaving a mess, then really who cares in the first place. This is that section of the military road after Lough that does quite a steep ascent onto a pass before dropping down into Glenmalure. As I said, when I set out, I wasn't expecting this. I hadn't cycled this bit of the route before, so it's an extra bit of climb to keep in mind.
So that ascent, and I'm not finished it yet, out of Lough on the old military road caught me by surprise. Much more severe than I expected. Good news, I'm not going to be backtracking over it. Once I go over this ridge into Glenmalure, then I can go out along the bottom of the Glenmalure Valley. And you could have got in that way by staying on the low road and going around, I think. But sure, you know, as I'm always saying, the pain of going up the hills is met by the beauty of going down. So off we go.
this really did keep on going up and up. I kept thinking I was near the top, and then I'd go around the corner and be like, oh no, still some more of this to go. It's very beautiful. The views off to the left there are very spectacular, and then on your way down the other side they'll be really spectacular. On to the right, the top of it, once again you're getting into woodlands. There's places to stop, take a breath, have a look at the view, and then right at the top there is a car parking space again, I think on the Wicklow Way, named after and across from the monument to the cyclist Shay Elliott. I think the route of the Wicklow 200, which is an annual long distance cycle in the Wicklow Mountains, goes this way. But once you're up there, you've beaten the hill. It's now this great steep ascent roaring down the hill all the way down to when you intersect the road that runs into the Glenmalure Valley. Again, really spectacular road, well worth doing in itself. Now we're cycling. This is a dead end, by the way. This is heading up into the Glenmalure Valley. The Glenmalure Valley ends in Lough, which is one of Ireland's 6 highest mountains. It's on the left-hand side here. And as you go up, there's a number of spots where people camp, including this real mass camping spot that's coming up just past the sand quarry on the left. There's the quarry. Then the first turn in after it, you'll see there's a lot of people camping here. If you wanted to take a more luxury option, there is a hotel just at the point where that road dropped down to the road running through Glenmalure. And it's actually pretty good value. If I remember correctly, it's something like £100 a room per night. So I think that is the Glenmalure Lodge or the Glenmalure Hotel, not quite sure which. There is also a youth hostel right at the very top of this road, and in fact it's the point I stopped cycling at. Cross the bridge here, go up the gravel track, and then this last building we're going to stop at is the youth hostel. There's also, back at that bridge, there were a few people camping in the car park there.
And so that's us having reached Glenmalure. As you'll have seen, there's quite a lot of people camping down here as things are. A very warm weekend after a very wet August, I'm not surprised. But yeah, there's lots and lots of places around. And also, as coming over the pass, the military road at the top, there was lots there as well, so it's not like there's any shortage. And once you're down here, you're most of the way through the Wicklow Mountains. You've got Lough over here, basically. It's the last really significant height. And you're at the doorway, I guess, for Waterford and Wexford and so on down to Cork. So it either makes a quite sensible 1 or 2 night trip down from Dublin, or as the start of some bigger tour if you're arriving in Dublin and you want to head off and you intend to do most of that while you're actually cycling. But yep, here we go.
I hope this route has been useful to you. Do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Give the video a like, and if you have any questions either about this route or about backpacking in general, please ask away in the comments and I'll respond to them.